Everyone laughed when my sister's boyfriend called me unemployed at the dinner table. What no one realized in that moment was that the joke he told so casually would become the reason his entire life unraveled. So, how did a single sentence, spoken over dessert and laughter, turn into the beginning of the end? My name is Joanna Miles. I'm 26 years old. And this is the story of how I learned that in my family, image always comes first, and the truth only matters when it's impossible to ignore. Growing up, I understood very early what my role was supposed to be. Not because anyone sat me down and explained it, but because it was reinforced quietly, over years, in 1,000 small ways. I was the one who didn't quite fit the picture. The one whose choices needed explanation. The one people spoke about with careful wording, lowered voices, and polite concern that never quite hid disappointment. My family wasn't cruel in obvious ways. There were no shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Instead, there were raised eyebrows, pauses that lingered a second too long, questions disguised as interest but weighted with judgment. So what are you doing these days? Any updates? Have you figured things out yet? I learned to answer those questions with minimal detail. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I learned quickly that the more I explained, the more space I gave them to dissect my life like a problem that needed fixing. On paper, I was doing fine. I worked independently, took on consulting projects, short-term contracts, analytical work that required focus and precision. It wasn't flashy. It didn't come with titles people could brag about at dinner parties. And in my family, if your success couldn't be summarized in one impressive sentence, it barely existed at all. My parents valued appearances the way some people value tradition. Quietly, firmly, without ever questioning why. Our house was always neat. Conversations were polite. Problems were handled privately, if they were acknowledged at all. The unspoken rule was simple: don't embarrass the family, and don't disrupt the image we present to the world. I had broken that rule simply by being myself. So, when I got the message inviting me to Sunday dinner, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The kind that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with anticipation. I already knew how the evening would go. I would arrive on time. I would sit where I was told. I would speak when spoken to. I would smile when appropriate. And I would leave feeling slightly smaller than when I arrived. Still, I went. I always did. Their neighborhood hadn't changed since I left for college. Trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, houses that looked calm from the outside, as if nothing uncomfortable ever happened behind closed doors. I parked in the driveway, took a breath, and reminded myself that this was just dinner. A few hours, nothing more. Inside, my mother was arranging plates on the kitchen island with the precision of someone preparing a display rather than a meal. She greeted me with a quick smile, already glancing at the clock as if checking off an item on a list. She didn't ask how I was. She asked why I was cutting it close, even though I wasn't late. My father sat at the table reading mail, nodding in acknowledgement without looking up. It wasn't hostility. It was something colder, indifference disguised as politeness. The kind that lets everyone pretend nothing is wrong. I took my seat quietly, as I always did. A few minutes later, my sister walked in. She looked radiant in the effortless way that always drew admiration from our parents. And behind her was Evan, her boyfriend. The reason this dinner felt different. The reason everyone seemed slightly more alert, slightly more invested. Evan had a presence that filled the room the moment he stepped inside. Not loud, not aggressive, just confident in a way that made people lean in. He shook my parents' hands with ease, smiled at the right moments, said all the right things. I watched their postures shift instantly, shoulders straightening, expressions warming. Approval didn't need words in that room. You could feel it. This was my first time seeing him in a full family setting, and I understood immediately why my sister was proud to bring him home. Evan was everything my parents admired. Well-spoken, self-assured, polished. He moved like someone used to being listened to. Dinner began, and the conversation flowed easily, just not toward me. My mother asked Evan about his week, laughing a little too loudly at his stories. My father encouraged him to talk about work, nodding as if he understood every detail, even when the terms grew abstract. My sister watched them all with quiet satisfaction, like someone who had finally completed a difficult task. I listened more than I spoke. That had become second nature to me. Listening allowed me to stay invisible, and invisibility was safer. But at tables like that, invisibility never lasted long. Eventually, the conversation drifted in my direction. Not out of curiosity, but out of habit. My family had a way of checking progress under the guise of concern. They measured life in milestones they could explain to others. Anything outside that framework made them uncomfortable. Evan turned to me with an easy smile and asked about my work. His tone was casual, friendly even, but there was something beneath it, an expectation. I answered briefly, truthfully, without embellishment. The silence that followed said more than any comment could have. I saw my mother shift in her seat. My father's jaw tightened. My sister focused on her plate. And Evan noticed. He always noticed. He leaned back slightly, as if settling into a role he knew well. And that was when the evening quietly began to change, though none of them realized it yet. Because while everyone else was focused on the performance unfolding in front of them, I was paying attention to something else entirely. Not the laughter, not the judgment, but the details. The words, the confidence that felt rehearsed rather than earned. I didn't know it yet, but that night wasn't just another family dinner. It was the moment I stopped absorbing the narrative they had written for me and started seeing the cracks in the one they believed so completely. And once you see those cracks, you can never unsee them. Evan didn't sit down like a guest. He settled in like he belonged there. The chair barely scraped the floor when he pulled it back, and the movement felt practiced, effortless, as if he had already memorized the layout of the room before ever stepping inside. He greeted my parents again once everyone was seated, polite but relaxed, the way people do when they're confident they've already made a good impression and are now simply maintaining it. My mother leaned toward him almost immediately. She asked about his week, her voice lighter than it had been when she spoke to me earlier, her laugh coming quickly, easily, as if she'd been waiting for a reason to use it. Evan responded with stories that were harmless on the surface. Busy days, meetings, a project that required late nights. Nothing extraordinary. But the way he told them mattered more than the content itself. He spoke with rhythm. He paused at the right moments. He made eye contact just long enough to make each person feel included, understood. My father nodded along, occasionally interjecting with questions that weren't really questions, more like confirmations. That must be demanding. Sounds like a lot of responsibility, Evan agreed without bragging, a balance that impressed them more than confidence alone ever could. I watched the shift happen in real time. My parents straightened their posture, their expressions softened. The room adjusted around him, subtly but undeniably. It was the same dynamic I'd seen play out my entire life whenever someone entered our home who matched their unspoken standards. Titles mattered. Stability mattered. The ability to sound impressive without sounding desperate mattered most of all. Evan fit seamlessly into that mold. My sister barely spoke at first. She didn't need to. Her smile said enough. She watched our parents respond to Evan the way she'd hoped they would, and every approving nod felt like a quiet victory for her. I understood that look. It was the look of someone finally feeling validated by proxy, like she had presented them with proof that she had done something right. I stayed quiet, not out of discomfort, but out of habit. Silence had become my safest position in rooms like that. When I didn't speak, I couldn't be misinterpreted. I couldn't disappoint anyone further. And besides, no one seemed to notice my absence from the conversation anyway. The talk moved easily from work to ambition, from ambition to future plans. Evan spoke about growth, about building something sustainable, about surrounding himself with the right people. His language was polished but not overly technical, carefully calibrated to sound knowledgeable without alienating his audience. My parents absorbed every word as if he were outlining a blueprint for the kind of life they admired. Occasionally, my mother glanced in my direction, not to include me, but to check whether I might interrupt the flow with something unexpected. I recognized that look immediately. It was the same one she used whenever a relative visited or when friends came over for dinner. It was a reminder without words. Don't say anything that makes us look bad. I kept my eyes on my plate. Evan didn't ignore me, though. He was too perceptive for that. He included me just enough to appear considerate. He asked small, neutral questions. He smiled when I answered. But even then, there was a subtle distance, as if he were cataloging me rather than engaging with me. Observing, measuring, deciding where I fit into the hierarchy he seemed to understand instinctively. As the meal progressed, his stories became slightly more detailed. He talked about collaboration, about analysis, about strategic reviews and decision-making processes. The terms flowed smoothly, layered just enough to create the impression of depth. My father leaned in more when Evan spoke like that. My mother nodded proudly, as if she were already imagining telling someone else about him later. I noticed something else too. Evan never lingered on specifics. He referenced departments, initiatives, responsibilities, but always in broad strokes. Whenever a detail threatened to become too precise, he redirected, shifting the focus back to outcomes rather than methods. It was subtle, elegant, even. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but I did. Not because I was suspicious at that moment, but because I recognized the pattern. I had spent years working in environments where clarity mattered, where vague language was often used to hide uncertainty. Evan's confidence wasn't loud, but it was curated. It felt assembled from pieces that sounded right rather than experiences that had been lived. Still, at that point, it was nothing more than an observation, a faint impression I filed away without judgment. People perform all the time, especially in rooms where they want to be accepted. The attention inevitably shifted. It always did. My family had a ritual, whether they realized it or not. At some point during every gathering, they turned their focus toward me, not out of interest, but out of expectation. It was their way of taking inventory, measuring progress, confirming narratives. Evan followed their lead naturally, like someone who had already learned the rules of the room. He asked about my work again, this time with a softer tone, as if inviting me to participate rather than placing me on display. I answered simply. Honestly, I gave no context beyond what was necessary. The room responded immediately. My mother adjusted her posture. My father's expression tightened. My sister's smile flickered, just for a second. It wasn't disappointment exactly, it was discomfort, the kind that surfaces when reality doesn't align with the story people prefer to tell. Evan noticed that too. He leaned back slightly, resting one arm against the chair, and began talking again. This time, not about his own work directly, but about concepts, stability, direction, the importance of staying productive. He spoke as if he were sharing general wisdom, advice that applied to everyone and no one at the same time. My parents laughed at the right moments. They nodded in agreement. My sister relaxed again, reassured that the spotlight had shifted back where it belonged. I listened. And as Evan continued, layering his thoughts with anecdotes and professional language, I felt something click quietly in the back of my mind. Not suspicion, not anger, just awareness. The sense that I was watching a performance unfold, one that everyone else accepted without question. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge him. I didn't correct anything he said. I let the evening move forward exactly as it wanted to. Because in moments like that, reacting only reinforces the role you've been given. And I was no longer interested in playing mine. By the time dessert arrived, the room was fully aligned around Evan. He had become the evening's centerpiece without ever demanding it. My parents looked satisfied. My sister looked proud. The image they valued so deeply had been restored, strengthened even. I sat there quietly, absorbing it all, not with resentment, but with clarity. Something about Evan's confidence didn't sit the way it should have. It wasn't wrong, just too smooth, too controlled, like someone who knew exactly which version of himself to present and when. I didn't know yet what that meant. I didn't know where it would lead. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. That dinner wasn't just about me being overlooked again. It was about me noticing something everyone else had missed. And once you notice that, you don't laugh along anymore. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It crept in quietly, the way tension always does when people believe they're still being polite. By the time the plates were mostly empty, the room had settled into a comfortable rhythm. My parents were relaxed now, satisfied in that particular way that came from hosting someone they could be proud of. My sister leaned slightly toward Evan, her body language open, almost protective. The laughter that floated around the table wasn't loud anymore, just warm enough to suggest that the evening was going exactly as planned. That was when Evan leaned forward again. He didn't announce himself, he didn't clear his throat or wait for silence. He simply spoke, sliding into the conversation as smoothly as he had all night, like someone who knew the room would make space for him automatically. He started talking about ambition. Not his own, at least not directly. He framed it as an observation, something he'd noticed about people in general. How some people moved quickly, chasing opportunities. How others took their time, figuring things out at their own pace. His tone was light, thoughtful, almost generous. The kind of voice people use when they want to sound understanding rather than judgmental. My mother laughed softly, the polite kind of laugh she reserved for comments she agreed with but didn't want to appear too enthusiastic about. My father nodded, as if Evan had just articulated something he himself had always believed but never bothered to say out loud. My sister smiled, eyes flicking between Evan and my parents, reading the room with practiced ease. I stayed quiet. Evan continued, building gently, layering his words. He talked about structure, about discipline, about how important it was to stay productive, even when things weren't clear yet. He never used names, never pointed fingers. But the direction of his words was unmistakable. The air shifted. I could feel it the way you feel a change in temperature before anyone comments on it. The conversation slowed, just slightly, as if the table itself were leaning in, waiting to see where this was going. Then Evan smiled at me. It wasn't cruel. That was the part that made it worse. It was casual, friendly, the smile of someone who believed he was being inclusive. He turned his body toward me, resting his elbow lightly on the table, and asked his question as if it were nothing more than harmless curiosity. "So," he said, "do you still have a lot of free time during the day?" The words landed softly, almost gently, and for a split second, no one reacted. Then my mother laughed. It came out quick and controlled, the sound she made when she wanted to smooth over discomfort without actually addressing it. My father let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slightly, like this was all very familiar, very expected. My sister dropped her gaze to her plate, pushing a piece of food around with her fork as if suddenly fascinated by it. The table laughed. Not loudly, not uproariously, but enough. Enough for the meaning to settle. Enough for the implication to crystallize. Unemployed. That was the word hanging in the air, even though Evan never said it outright. He didn't have to. The room filled it in for him. Years of quiet assumptions rushed forward to complete the sentence he had carefully left unfinished. I felt the heat rise in my face, not from embarrassment, but from recognition. I had been here before, in different forms, different rooms, different voices. The pattern was always the same. Someone made a comment that could be defended as a joke. Everyone laughed, and if I reacted, even calmly, I would be the problem. Too sensitive, too defensive. Unable to take humor, the one who ruined the mood. So, I didn't react. I sat there, hands folded loosely in my lap, breathing evenly, watching the moment unfold as if from a distance. Evan kept talking, encouraged by the response. He added a few more comments, still light, still smiling. He spoke about how important it was to stay active, how drifting for too long could become a habit. He said it with the confidence of someone who believed he was offering wisdom rather than passing judgment. My parents listened attentively. My mother nodded, her lips pressed together in approval. My father swirled the wine in his glass, gaze fixed on the liquid as if considering how best to expand on Evan's point. My sister glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable, then turned back to Evan. No one asked how I felt. No one checked in. The assumption was clear. I was expected to absorb it, to take it the way I always had. Quietly, gracefully, without disruption. Evan, sensing no resistance, leaned back in his chair again, satisfied. He launched into a longer explanation about work ethic, about how people who succeed rarely waste time waiting for clarity. He spoke like a lecturer addressing a room of willing students. The irony didn't seem to register with anyone else at the table. I listened, and while he spoke, something else happened beneath the surface of my attention. He mentioned a project he claimed to be involved in, a type of analytical review that required coordination across departments. He described the process with confidence, sprinkling in terminology that sounded impressive enough to pass without scrutiny. Except one detail didn't align. It was small, almost invisible. The kind of thing most people would never notice, especially not in a casual conversation over dinner. But I noticed it because I knew that type of review. I had worked adjacent to it before, and the way Evan described it didn't fit the structure he claimed to operate within. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was worse. It was a misplacement, a detail borrowed from somewhere else and dropped into the wrong context. My breath caught for half a second. I didn't react outwardly. I didn't change my expression. I didn't interrupt him. I let him keep talking, let the table keep laughing at the right moments, let my parents remain comfortably convinced that the man sitting across from me was everything they admired. But inside, something shifted. The humiliation from moments earlier didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It sharpened, focused. It turned from something I absorbed into something I examined. I began listening differently, not as someone being judged, but as someone observing a performance. I paid attention to how Evan adjusted his language depending on who he addressed, how his confidence grew when no one challenged him, how the room rewarded him with approval every time he spoke with certainty, regardless of substance. Dessert arrived, breaking the tension without dissolving it. Plates were cleared. The conversation softened. Laughter returned to its earlier warmth. To anyone watching from the outside, the evening would have looked successful, even pleasant. But for me, the damage had already been done. Not because Evan had mocked me, but because he had done it so easily, because he had felt safe enough, supported enough, to reduce me to a punchline in a room full of people who were supposed to know me best. And because, in doing so, he had revealed something he didn't realize he was revealing at all. I didn't say a word when I stood up from the table. I thanked my mother for dinner. I nodded to my father. I smiled at my sister. I even met Evan's eyes briefly and returned his smile, calm and unreadable. No one stopped me as I left. Outside, the night air felt cooler than I expected. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I replayed the evening in my mind, not with anger, but with precision. The comment, the laughter, the detail that didn't belong. At the time, I didn't know what I would do with that information. I didn't have a plan. I didn't feel the need for revenge. What I felt was something quieter and far more dangerous. Clarity. And once clarity settles in, pretending stops being an option. That night, as I drove away from my parents' house, I understood something that would change the course of everything that followed. The joke wasn't the moment that broke me. It was the moment that woke me up. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was angry, and not because I replayed the laughter over and over in my head. I'd grown used to moments like that. What kept me awake was quieter than anger and sharper than embarrassment. It was the detail Evan had mentioned so casually, the one that didn't belong where he had placed it. The more I tried to dismiss it, the louder it became in my thoughts, like a loose thread brushing against skin you can't stop noticing. By morning, the house was silent. Sunlight spilled through the window in thin lines as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, the sound of the machine filling the space that conversation never did. I told myself to let it go. People exaggerate all the time, especially people trying to impress. There was no reason to attach meaning to a single inconsistency in an otherwise polished story. But clarity has a way of lingering once it arrives. As I sat down with my mug, my mind returned to the way Evan had described his role, the confidence with which he'd spoken about responsibilities that didn't align with the structure he claimed to work within. It wasn't a mistake someone experienced would make. And it wasn't the kind of error that came from nerves. It felt rehearsed, like a line memorized from somewhere else and delivered without full understanding. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough to justify anything. I wasn't looking to prove him wrong. I wasn't trying to reclaim my dignity from the night before. If anything, I wanted to be wrong. The alternative would mean acknowledging something far more uncomfortable. So, I started with the simplest step: curiosity without intention. I opened my laptop and began searching for publicly available information. Nothing invasive, nothing hidden, just company structures, organizational charts, press releases, the kind of information anyone could access with a few minutes of patience. At first, everything seemed to line up. Evan's name appeared where it should. The company existed. The departments existed. On the surface, the image held. But the details he had spoken about at dinner weren't there. Not in descriptions of active projects. Not in outlines of responsibilities. Not even in the vague language companies use when they want to sound expansive without committing to specifics. The processes he described belonged to different teams entirely, often in different divisions, sometimes in different regions. I paused, staring at the screen longer than necessary. There were explanations for that. Cross-functional work, temporary assignments, internal initiatives that never make it into public documentation. I reminded myself of all of them. But even then, the fit felt forced, like pieces pressed together that didn't want to lock. I closed my laptop and leaned back, trying to shake the feeling. This wasn't my business. Evan wasn't my responsibility. Whatever he was or wasn't doing had nothing to do with me. Except it did. Not because of the joke, not because of the humiliation, but because of how easily my family had handed him authority, how quickly they had accepted his narrative and used it, consciously or not, to reinforce their assumptions about me. That part didn't sting anymore. It clarified something I had avoided for years. They trusted confidence more than consistency, image more than evidence. That realization stayed with me throughout the day, humming beneath everything else I tried to focus on. By late afternoon, I knew I wasn't going to let it go. Not because I needed answers immediately, but because once you start seeing patterns, ignoring them feels dishonest. I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Alex wasn't a close friend, but we had worked together on a contracting assignment years earlier. He was methodical, discreet, and good at noticing things other people overlooked. When I sent him a message asking if he had time to help with something small, he didn't ask questions. He simply replied that he could take a look. I didn't give him the full story. I didn't mention my family, the dinner, or the comment that had started all of this. I kept it professional. A name, a company, a few general questions about role alignment and public records. Nothing that crossed boundaries. Nothing that required access to anything private. Then I waited. In the meantime, I went back through the evening in my mind, this time with a different lens. I remembered the way Evan shifted his tone depending on who he was speaking to, how he used broader language with my parents and slightly more technical terms when he addressed me, as if assuming I might catch something others wouldn't. I remembered how quickly he filled silences, how rarely he paused long enough for anyone else to question him. That wasn't arrogance, it was control. The next day, Alex replied. He didn't say anything dramatic. He didn't accuse. He simply noted that something was unusual. Evan's name appeared in public filings, connected to a small consulting entity, registered under a virtual office address. No website. No staff listings. No visible projects. The company existed on paper and nowhere else. I stared at the message, my chest tightening slightly. There were innocent explanations for that, too. People register companies all the time. Side projects, freelance work, administrative placeholders. I thanked Alex and told him not to worry about it, that it was probably nothing. But even as I typed the words, I knew they weren't true. I asked him, carefully, if he could look a little deeper. Not for wrongdoing, just for context. That night, I didn't feel anxious or excited. I felt steady, focused. The emotional charge of the dinner had faded, replaced by something colder and more precise. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about understanding what I was actually looking at. While Alex worked, I continued my own search. I looked for conference appearances Evan had mentioned. Panels, talks, publications, anything that would leave a digital footprint. There was nothing. Not even in the obscure corners of the internet where niche events tend to live long after they're forgotten. Everything he had claimed sounded impressive. And everything disappeared the moment I looked for proof. The following evening, Alex sent another message. This one was longer. He had traced small transactions linked to the consulting entity. Irregular deposits. No clear source of revenue. No corresponding invoices or contracts. The amounts weren't massive, but they were consistent enough to suggest a pattern. I read the message twice, then set my phone down. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised. What I felt was confirmation. Evan wasn't just embellishing, he was performing, building an image piece by piece, borrowing credibility from structures he didn't fully inhabit. And my family had embraced that image because it fit what they wanted to see. I closed my laptop that night with a strange sense of calm. I didn't know what I would do next, and I didn't feel the need to decide yet. There was no urgency, no impulse to expose him immediately. Truth doesn't need to rush. It only needs patience. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. Whatever Evan was hiding, it wasn't sustainable. And when something built on performance finally cracks, it never does so quietly. I didn't realize it then, but everything that followed began with that single choice to look closer, even when looking away would have been easier. After that night, time seemed to slow in a way I hadn't experienced before. Days passed, but the weight of what I had begun to uncover didn't fade with distance. If anything, it settled deeper, becoming part of my awareness the way background noise does, easy to ignore if you choose to, impossible to unhear once you've noticed it. I went back to my routines. I worked. I answered emails. I met deadlines. From the outside, nothing had changed, but underneath that surface, my focus had sharpened. I was no longer just curious. I was paying attention with intention. The information Alex had sent replayed in my mind. Not the numbers themselves, but what they implied. A company that existed without presence. Money that moved without a clear purpose. Claims that sounded impressive but dissolved the moment anyone asked for substance. None of it was dramatic on its own. That was the unsettling part. The truth wasn't loud. It was quiet, orderly, almost polite. I reminded myself repeatedly that I wasn't investigating a crime. I wasn't trying to destroy someone's life. What I was doing was understanding the structure of a story that had been presented as fact and discovering how much of it relied on belief rather than evidence. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Evan's confidence hadn't been reckless. It had been calculated. He didn't overwhelm people with detail. He offered just enough. He relied on tone, timing, and certainty to carry him through conversations where no one was inclined to question him. That realization reframed the dinner entirely. The joke at my expense hadn't been impulsive. It had been strategic, a way to elevate himself by contrast, to demonstrate authority without directly asserting it. And my family, eager to admire someone who fit their definition of success, had accepted the framing without hesitation. That wasn't personal, it was structural. Once I understood that, the emotional sting of the moment lost its power. In its place came something steadier. Resolve. I continued researching, this time with more direction. I looked at timelines. I mapped out when Evan claimed to have moved between roles, when certain projects supposedly began and ended. I compared those statements to what was publicly available, not looking for contradictions, but for coherence. A real career leaves patterns. Even when details are private, the outline holds. Evans didn't. His narrative shifted depending on the context. Sometimes he emphasized leadership, other times, technical depth. Sometimes he described hands-on involvement, other times, high-level oversight. Each version sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they didn't align. I reached out to Alex again, asking him to check something specific. This time, he hesitated briefly, not because he couldn't do it, but because he wanted to be clear about boundaries. I appreciated that. We agreed to stick strictly to publicly accessible records and patterns that could be verified without speculation. When he sent the next update, I felt the last pieces click into place. The deposits he had flagged earlier weren't random. When arranged chronologically, they followed a rhythm. Small amounts at first, gradual increases, occasional spikes, then plateaus. It resembled staged contributions rather than income from a stable operation. There were no corresponding expenses that suggested real business activity. No payroll, no vendor payments, no operational footprint. It wasn't illegal, not necessarily, but it wasn't what Evan had described either. At the same time, my own searches turned up something else. A forum discussion buried deep in an online community focused on private investment opportunities. A username that matched Evan's phrasing almost perfectly. The same tone, the same buzzwords, the same careful balance between confidence and vagueness. The posts weren't frequent, but they were consistent. Some replies praised him. Others asked for clarification he never provided. One comment mentioned money that hadn't been returned after promises of progress that never materialized. The post was old, nearly 2 years, but it lingered there, unresolved. I didn't need more than that. Not because it proved wrongdoing, but because it revealed intent. Evan wasn't just embellishing a resume. He was constructing credibility where none existed, relying on trust rather than transparency. And that made his presence in my sister's life suddenly feel heavier, more consequential than a single dinner table insult. I sat with that realization for a long time. It would have been easy to stop there, to tell myself it wasn't my place, that my sister was an adult capable of making her own decisions, that exposing any of this would only make me look bitter or vindictive, especially given the history my family preferred to remember. But this wasn't about being right. It was about recognizing a pattern that could cause real harm if left unchecked. I didn't confront anyone, not my parents, not my sister, and certainly not Evan. I didn't hint at what I knew, or ask questions that might alert him. I understood enough now to know that people who build themselves on illusion are careful when they sense scrutiny. Instead, I organized everything. I created a folder and placed each piece of information inside it. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just methodically. Public filings, transaction summaries, screenshots of forum posts, notes from Alex's analysis. Each item stood on its own. Together, they told a story Evan had never intended anyone to read from start to finish. While I worked, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter, not empowered, not triumphant, just clear. For years, I had carried the weight of being perceived as the one who lagged behind, the one who needed more time, more direction, more justification. Now, for the first time, I wasn't measuring myself against anyone else's version of success. I was simply observing reality as it was. A week later, the wedding invitation arrived. Cream-colored envelope, gold lettering, my sister's name printed elegantly alongside Evan's. The date was closer than I expected. I held the card in my hands longer than necessary, not because of sentiment, but because of recognition. This was the stage where everything Evan had built would be displayed most confidently, where appearances would matter more than ever, where my family would be at their most invested in believing the story they'd chosen. I RSVP'd that night. Attending wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even curiosity. It was practicality. If there was ever going to be a moment when truth could no longer be brushed aside, it would be there, surrounded by witnesses, anchored in documents, impossible to dismiss as misunderstanding. After that, the silence continued. My parents didn't ask about my plans. My sister didn't check in. Evan didn't reach out. Life moved forward as if the dinner had resolved itself neatly, filed away as another awkward moment no one intended to revisit. I let them believe that. In the days leading up to the wedding, Alex sent one final message. He had found additional references to the same online persona connected to Evan. Different platforms, same patterns, same promises, same lack of follow-through. Nothing definitive enough for authorities, enough to understand the scale. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. By then, the folder on my desk was complete. I didn't feel nervous. I didn't feel righteous. I felt prepared. Whatever happened next wouldn't be fueled by emotion or accusation. It would be guided by timing. And timing, I had learned, mattered far more than volume. I didn't know exactly how the truth would surface. I only knew that it would. And that, when it did, I wouldn't need to say much at all. The wedding morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate. I woke earlier than usual, not because I was anxious, but because my body had already settled into a kind of alert calm. The sky outside my window was overcast, a soft gray that flattened everything it touched. It wasn't gloomy, just muted, like the world itself was holding its breath. I got dressed slowly, choosing clothes that blended rather than stood out. Nothing dramatic, nothing attention-grabbing. I didn't want to look like someone arriving with a message. I wanted to look like exactly what I was supposed to be in that setting. Another quiet guest, easily overlooked, easily dismissed. The folder rested inside my bag, thin but heavy in a way that had nothing to do with paper. I checked once to make sure it was there, then didn't touch it again. I didn't need to. Knowing it existed was enough. The drive to the venue took longer than I expected. The road wound through vineyards and open fields, the kind of place chosen specifically because it photographed well. Signs guided guests toward the entrance, decorated with flowers and scripted lettering that spoke of beginnings, commitment, celebration. Everything about the location was intentional. Every detail curated to tell a story before anyone even stepped inside. When I arrived, people were already gathering. Small groups clustered near the entrance, adjusting jackets, smoothing dresses, exchanging greetings that hovered somewhere between excitement and performance. Laughter rose and fell in polite waves. Everyone looked slightly elevated, as if the occasion had lifted them just enough above their ordinary selves. I walked past them quietly. Inside, the space opened wide. White chairs arranged in neat rows, floral arrangements positioned at perfect intervals. Soft music playing in the background, chosen to create emotion without demanding attention. The kind of setting designed to make people feel like they were part of something meaningful, even if they didn't know why. My parents were easy to spot. They moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting guests, accepting compliments, radiating pride. My mother's smile was fixed but genuine. My father's posture was relaxed, confident. They looked like people who believed the day reflected well on them. My sister appeared shortly after, glowing in a way that drew immediate attention. She looked happy, not performatively so, but genuinely. There was an openness in her expression I hadn't seen in a long time, a softness that made her seem lighter than usual. For a brief moment, doubt flickered through me. Not about the truth, but about timing. About whether there was ever a right moment to disrupt something that looked so carefully built. Then Evan appeared. He stood near the front, talking to a small group of guests who leaned in instinctively as he spoke. His suit fit perfectly. His posture was relaxed but intentional. He smiled easily, laughed at the right moments, placed his hand lightly on shoulders as if everyone there already belonged to him in some small way. He looked exactly like the man everyone believed him to be. The ceremony began without delay. Music shifted. Guests took their seats. The air changed subtly, thickening with expectation. I found a place near the aisle, close enough to see clearly, far enough to remain unnoticed. When my sister walked down the aisle, the room softened. Faces turned. Phones lifted. Evan's expression shifted into something reverent, practiced but convincing. Applause followed them as they reached the front, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the image in front of us, two people framed by light, promising a future that looked unshakable from the outside. The vows were exchanged, rings placed, words spoken that carried weight simply because everyone agreed they should. I watched Evan closely as he spoke, not with suspicion, but with familiarity. He delivered his lines the way he delivered everything else, with confidence, warmth, and just enough emotion to feel sincere. The ceremony ended to applause, the sound filling the space easily. People stood, smiling, already shifting into celebration mode. The illusion held perfectly. The reception flowed seamlessly from there, tables arranged with precision, glasses clinking, conversations overlapping in a pleasant hum. My parents floated from group to group, accepting congratulations that blurred together into a single affirmation. My sister and Evan made their rounds, receiving smiles, hugs, praise. I stayed where I was for a while, observing. Evan was in his element. He spoke easily with guests, adapting his tone effortlessly depending on who stood in front of him. Older relatives received respectful warmth, friends got humor, acquaintances were met with confident charm. He never lingered too long in one place, never gave anyone the chance to ask a question that might require depth rather than performance. It was impressive, and it was fragile. I waited until the speeches ended and guests began drifting toward the buffet, their attention shifting from the couple to food and conversation. The room loosened, the focus dispersed. That was the moment when things were least guarded, when people felt safest. I moved then. Not quickly. Not dramatically. I crossed the room at an even pace, weaving between tables, my presence barely registering. My sister noticed me first. Her eyes widened slightly, then softened. She smiled, surprised, as if my being there meant something reassuring. Evan noticed a moment later. His smile faltered, just briefly, before settling back into place. I stood in front of them, close enough that conversation around us dimmed without fully stopping. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for privacy. I didn't accuse. I opened my bag and took out the folder. I held it out, letting Evan see the first page. Confusion crossed his face, followed by something sharper. Recognition, maybe, or fear. He glanced at the papers, then at me, then back again. My sister leaned closer, curiosity replacing her smile as she read the top lines. Her expression changed slowly. Not dramatically, not with tears or anger. Just a gradual tightening, like someone realizing the ground beneath them wasn't as solid as they believed. Evan tried to speak. He laughed lightly, as if this were a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over. He said a few words that didn't connect to each other, explanations that dissolved before they could fully form. The more he talked, the clearer it became that he wasn't in control anymore. People nearby began to notice. My parents approached, irritation already on their faces. My mother asked what I was doing. My father's tone was sharp, protective. They saw the papers, the tension, the way Evan's composure cracked under scrutiny, and immediately chose a side. Not the truth. The image. I didn't argue with them. I didn't defend myself. I didn't narrate the contents of the folder or explain how long it had taken to gather. I said one sentence, calmly, clearly, without emotion. You should know who you married. Then I stepped back. What followed wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was worse. Evan's inability to provide a coherent response, his shifting explanations, the way his confidence evaporated when certainty was required rather than assumed. Each reaction revealed more than any document ever could. My sister watched him unravel in real time. My parents spoke over each other, trying to contain the situation, trying to restore order, trying to protect the version of the day they wanted to remember. Guests murmured. Conversations stalled. The room tilted, just slightly, away from celebration. I didn't stay to see how it resolved. I turned and walked away, past the tables, past the decorations, past the carefully constructed atmosphere that no longer held. No one followed me. No one called my name. Evan was too busy scrambling to reclaim control. My parents were too focused on damage control. My sister stood frozen, staring at a future she no longer recognized. Outside, the air felt lighter. I reached my car, placed the now empty folder on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the reception behind me. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was release. The truth hadn't needed a stage. It had simply needed the right moment. And that moment had passed. I didn't leave the venue immediately. I stepped outside. Yes, but I stayed close enough to hear the music drifting through the open doors, softened now, uneven in rhythm. Laughter still surfaced here and there, but it sounded strained, like people trying to convince themselves the celebration hadn't cracked. I stood near my car for a moment, keys in my hand, breathing slowly, letting the adrenaline drain from my body. I had done what I came to do. What happened next was never going to be under my control. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. Then again, and again. I didn't look at it right away. I already knew who it would be. When I finally checked, there were messages from my mother, my father, my sister, Different tones, same urgency. Where are you? What were you thinking? We need to talk. Now. I put the phone back in my pocket and leaned against the car, staring out at the long stretch of road that led away from the venue. Part of me expected to feel fear. Another part expected guilt. What I felt instead was something closer to inevitability. I had interrupted the image. And that, more than the truth itself, was unforgivable to them. I waited until my breathing steadied, then walked back inside. The atmosphere had changed. It wasn't chaos. It was worse than that. It was containment. Conversations were quieter. Groups were tighter. People avoided eye contact, their curiosity battling their manners. Someone had turned the music up slightly, as if volume could smooth over tension. I spotted my parents first. They were standing near the edge of the room, my mother's smile rigid, my father's expression closed. When they saw me, relief flickered briefly across their faces before hardening into irritation. My mother spoke first. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask what I had uncovered. She asked why I would choose today of all days to do something so selfish. Selfish. The word landed heavily, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. It was the same word they had used in different forms my entire life whenever I disrupted their expectations. I listened without interrupting as she continued, explaining how embarrassing the situation was, how people were talking, how this would follow the family for years. My father stood beside her, arms crossed, nodding in agreement. He said I had no right to cause a scene based on assumptions. He said I should have come to them privately. He said some things didn't need to be exposed. I noticed what neither of them said. They didn't ask if the information was true. They didn't ask if my sister was safe. They didn't ask what kind of person Evan actually was. Image first, truth later, just like always. My sister stood a few feet away, silent. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed somewhere just past me. Evan hovered nearby, talking quickly to anyone who would listen, his voice low but urgent. He glanced over occasionally, his confidence replaced by something brittle and sharp. I turned toward my sister. For a moment, she didn't look at me. When she finally did, her expression held something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not betrayal, confusion. The kind that comes when the story you've built your future on suddenly stops making sense. She asked me quietly if what I had shown them was real. I nodded. I didn't elaborate. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need to. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just looked at Evan again, really looked at him this time, as if seeing him without the filter she had been holding up for months, maybe longer. That was when Evan stepped in. He tried to laugh it off at first, framing everything as a misunderstanding, a mix-up, an overreaction. When that didn't work, he shifted tactics, accusing me of jealousy, of resentment, of wanting attention. The words came faster now, less controlled, less convincing. Every sentence contradicted the one before it. My parents bristled, stepping toward him protectively, filling in the gaps for him, offering explanations he hadn't even asked for. Watching them do it felt surreal. They had spent years urging me to take responsibility for myself, to own my choices, to accept consequences, yet here they were, shielding a man they barely knew from accountability because he fit their image of success. I realized then that this wasn't about Evan anymore. He was just the catalyst. What we were confronting was the system my family had built and maintained long before he arrived. A system where certainty mattered more than consistency, where appearances were defended at all costs, where questioning the narrative was seen as disloyal. I spoke then, not loudly, not emotionally. I didn't list evidence. I didn't repeat accusations. I said only what mattered. I didn't bring this here to punish anyone, I said. I brought it here because pretending it doesn't exist doesn't make it go away. My father shook his head, frustration etched into every line of his face. He said I was always like this, always complicating things, always making situations heavier than they needed to be. And suddenly, something inside me settled. I had heard that version of me described so many times that it had almost started to feel real. But standing there, watching the truth bend around their discomfort, I understood something clearly for the first time. I wasn't complicating anything. I was refusing to participate in denial. That refusal had a cost. I could see it in the way my parents' disappointment sharpened into anger, in the way they closed ranks around Evan despite the cracks forming in his story, in the way my sister stood frozen between us, torn between loyalty and recognition. I felt the familiar pull to explain myself, to soften my words, to make them understand that I hadn't done this out of spite, that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, that I was only trying to be honest. Then I stopped. Because understanding had never been the problem. They understood enough. They always had. What they lacked wasn't information. It was willingness. I looked at my sister one last time. I didn't tell her what to do. I didn't urge her to leave or stay. That choice was hers, and it always had been. I simply met her eyes and let her see that whatever came next, she wouldn't be alone in the truth, even if she chose to turn away from it. Then I turned back to my parents. "I'm done," I said quietly. There was no dramatic pause, no reaction that matched the weight of the moment. My mother looked stunned. My father scoffed, as if he'd heard a childish threat rather than a final boundary. But I meant it. I walked past them, past Evan, past the clusters of guests pretending not to watch, and headed toward the exit. This time, no one stopped me. No one called after me. The space opened easily, as if the room itself understood that something irreversible had just occurred. Outside, the night had cooled. The sky was darker now, the gray replaced by deep blue. I walked to my car, got in, and closed the door gently behind me. As I drove away, I didn't feel like I had won anything. What I felt was something far more unfamiliar. Relief. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the responsibility of being who they needed me to be. I wasn't managing their comfort. I wasn't shrinking to maintain their image. I had said what needed to be said, and whatever they chose to do with the truth after that was no longer my burden to carry. The drive home was quiet. Not the heavy kind of quiet that presses against your chest, but a clearer one, the kind that settles after something long and unresolved finally reaches its end. The road stretched out in front of me, empty and steady, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to rush anywhere. I expected the night to catch up with me. The arguments, the looks on my parents' faces, the sound of my sister's voice when she asked if what I'd shown her was real. I thought those images would replay in my mind, looping the way moments like that usually do. But they didn't. Instead, there was space. It surprised me how quickly the tension left my body, how naturally my shoulders relaxed once the decision had been made and acted upon. I realized then that I hadn't been holding on to anger all those years. I'd been holding on to responsibility. The responsibility of being patient, of being understanding, of not making things harder for people who had never made room for me. That weight was gone now. When I reached my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I set my keys down, placed my bag on the chair, and stood by the window, looking out at the city below. Life continued, indifferent to what had just happened. Cars passed. Windows glowed softly. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed. It felt grounding. My phone buzzed again. Messages stacked on the screen, some apologetic, some defensive, some carefully neutral. I didn't open them. Not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because I finally understood something that had taken me years to accept. Not every conversation deserves an immediate response. Some truths need distance to settle. Some people need time to decide whether they want reality or comfort. And some explanations, no matter how carefully worded, will never land where they're not welcome. I made tea and sat down, letting the warmth of the mug seep into my hands. My thoughts drifted, not to the wedding itself, but to smaller moments from my childhood. Times when I'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. Times when I'd explained myself only to feel smaller afterward. Times when I'd believed that if I just tried harder, spoke better, succeeded more clearly, I would finally be seen. What struck me then wasn't sadness. It was clarity. I had been asking the wrong question my entire life. I kept wondering why my family couldn't understand me, when the real question was whether they ever wanted to. Understanding requires discomfort. It requires re-examining assumptions. And for people invested in a certain image of the world, discomfort feels like a threat. Evan had simply fit into a space that already existed. He didn't create the problem, he revealed it. In the days that followed, the fallout continued without me. My sister called once, late at night. Her voice sounded different, quieter, stripped of the certainty she'd carried for so long. She didn't ask me what to do. She didn't apologize. She just told me she was taking time away, that things didn't feel clear anymore. I told her that clarity doesn't come all at once, that it arrives in pieces, usually when you stop forcing it. I didn't push. I didn't warn. I trusted her to find her own footing, just as I had finally found mine. My parents didn't call. That absence spoke louder than any argument we could have had. And strangely, it didn't hurt the way it once would have. It confirmed what I already knew. They were still choosing the version of reality that felt safest to them. That choice was theirs to make. For the first time, I didn't feel obligated to wait for them to change. Weeks passed. Life settled into a new rhythm. I returned to my work with a sense of focus that felt unfamiliar, but welcome. Without the constant background noise of judgment, my thoughts moved more freely. Decisions came easier. I slept better. I noticed changes in myself that felt subtle but profound. I spoke less, but with more intention. I stopped anticipating disappointment before it happened. I stopped rehearsing explanations no one had asked for. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I stopped defining myself in opposition to anyone else. One evening, as I walked home after a long day, it occurred to me that I hadn't thought about the word unemployed in weeks. The label that had once carried so much weight had lost its power entirely. Not because I had proven it wrong, but because I had stopped accepting labels from people who didn't know the full story. That, I realized, was the real turning point. Not the dinner, not the documents, not even the wedding. It was the moment I understood that walking away wasn't a failure of communication. It was an act of self-respect. We talk so often about speaking up, about defending ourselves, about proving others wrong. Those things have their place, but no one talks enough about the strength it takes to step back and say, I don't need to convince you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop performing for people who only applaud when you play the role they assigned you. If you've listened to my story all the way through, I want you to know this. You're not weak for staying quiet, and you're not cruel for leaving. Growth doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like choosing peace over permission. And before you go, I want to ask you something. What do you think is harder? Speaking up when no one wants to listen, or walking away when you finally understand you don't have to? Thank you for giving this story your time. If stories like this resonate with you, I hope you'll consider subscribing to Hanjiwe Iyagi. There are many quiet stories still waiting to be told. Here is the closing reflection and call to action, written in a natural storytelling voice, calm, empathetic, and designed to linger emotionally and invite subscription. This story was never really about a joke at a dinner table, or even about a man who built his life on appearances. At its core, it was about something much quieter and far more familiar, the way families, workplaces, and entire systems often reward confidence over consistency, image over truth. It was about what happens when someone is reduced to a label, and how easy it is for everyone else to laugh along when that label fits a story they already believe. What made this story powerful wasn't the exposure or the moment the truth surfaced. It was the restraint, the choice to observe instead of explode, to wait instead of argue, to walk away not in anger, but in clarity. That kind of quiet strength is rarely celebrated, yet it's something many of us recognize deeply in ourselves. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should have seen you, if you've ever been underestimated because your path didn't look impressive enough on the surface, then this story wasn't just mine, it was yours too. At Hanjiwe Iyagi, we tell stories like this, stories about unspoken battles, quiet awakenings, and the moments that change us without making a sound. If this narrative stayed with you, if it made you pause or reflect, I invite you to subscribe and walk with us through more stories that don't shout but resonate. Thank you for listening.